The city of Crestwood was a place where skyscrapers kissed the clouds, and where the night was never truly dark, thanks to the perpetual glow of neon and streetlights. It was here that Sarah Ellis lived, on the 27th floor of the Horizon Tower. She was a woman who had carved out a niche for herself in the cutthroat world of corporate law, her life a testament to meticulous planning and relentless ambition. But beneath the facade of success, the shadows of Crestwood harbored secrets, and Sarah was about to become intimately acquainted with one. It began subtly, the kind of thing one might dismiss as forgetfulness or an oversight. Sarah would come home after a long day, her mind tangled with legal jargon and client meetings, only to find her mail in disarray on the hallway table. Envelopes that she had left neatly stacked would be scattered as if someone had rifled through them, yet nothing was missing. At first, she chalked it up to her own absent-mindedness, or perhaps a sudden gust of wind from the open window, though she couldn't recall leaving it open. Then there were the sounds. On nights when the city's usual cacophony died down, Sarah would hear the faint creak of footsteps on the wooden floor outside her apartment. They were always too soft to be her neighbor's heavy tread or the janitor's late-night rounds. These were deliberate, almost cautious, like someone trying not to be heard. She'd peer through the peephole into the dimly lit corridor, but it was always empty, the silence mocking her unease. The first real sign came one particularly humid evening in late spring. Sarah had returned from an exhausting day in court, her thoughts still haunted by the faces of the jury. As she slipped off her heels by the door, her eyes fell upon a small, ornate box on her coffee table. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't left that there. Approaching with cautious steps, she lifted the lid to find a delicate silver bracelet, one she had admired in a boutique window weeks ago. The realization that someone knew her tastes, her routines, sent a shiver down her spine. Paranoia began to seep into her daily life. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer, every echo carried a sinister undertone. She started noticing the same figure in the crowd during her morning jog in the park. Always at a distance, always just out of clear sight. At work, she felt as if someone was watching her through the office windows, their gaze like a physical touch on the back of her neck. For Sarah, the city that had once been a place of opportunity now felt like a labyrinth where she was the prey. She began to alter her routines, changing her jogging path, varying her hours at the office, but the feeling of being observed persisted, an invisible thread connecting her to an unseen observer. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyscrapers, casting long, ominous shadows, Sarah decided to confront her fear. She left her apartment and took the elevator down to the lobby, her heart pounding in her chest. She scanned the area, looking for anything out of place, anyone lingering too long. The doorman greeted her with his usual disinterested nod, and the residents passed by, some lost in their phones, others in conversation. Nothing seemed amiss, yet the sensation of being watched persisted. Walking quickly to the nearby coffee shop, a place she frequented, she chose a seat by the window, her back to the wall. Here she could watch the street, her eyes darting from face to face, trying to discern friend from potential foe. Sipping her coffee, she felt a moment of calm until the reflection in the window caught her eye. A figure was standing across the street, obscured by the glare of the streetlights, their form indistinct, but their posture unmistakably fixed on her. Panic threatened to overtake her, but she held it at bay. She couldn't confront this spectre directly, not yet. Instead, she noted the time, the location, and the general build of the figure in her mind, a mental file she was amassing against her unseen stalker. Back in her apartment, the feeling of being watched was almost palpable. Sarah checked every room, every closet, ensuring she was alone. But the night was young, and the shadows seemed to multiply, each corner of her home now a potential hiding spot for the watcher. She double-checked the locks, turned on all the lights, and settled into her evening, a lawyer by day, now preparing for a different kind of battle, one where the rules were written by madness. The watcher was out there somewhere, perhaps even now, his eyes on her through some unseen gap in the curtains, his presence a whisper in the dark. Sarah Ellis, who had argued cases before juries, now faced her most personal and terrifying case yet: the mystery of the watcher in the shadows. The days following Sarah's unsettling discovery at the coffee shop were marked by a pervasive sense of dread. Every morning, as she stepped out of her apartment, she felt like she was entering a stage where an unseen audience was waiting for her next move. Her once cherished routine now felt like a script dictated by someone else. At work, the gifts began. They started innocuously enough. A bouquet of lilies, her favorite, appeared on her desk, accompanied by a card that read only, "Thinking of you." There was no signature, just that message, handwritten in a script that was both elegant and chilling. Colleagues assumed it was from a secret admirer. Sarah knew better. The flowers were a silent testament to the intimacy of her stalker's knowledge of her life, a violation wrapped in beauty. The next day brought a more personal touch. A box of her favorite chocolates was waiting for her in the break room. The wrapper had been meticulously opened and reclosed, as if to check for allergies or preferences. The thought of someone knowing such details about her sent a cold wave of fear through her. She discarded the chocolates. The sweetness now turned bitter in her mind. As the week progressed, the gifts grew more intimate and invasive. A scarf she had admired online arrived at her doorstep, still in its packaging. Then, a book she had mentioned wanting to read in a passing conversation with a friend appeared on her coffee table. Each item was a breadcrumb leading back to the shadowy figure orchestrating this macabre dance of surveillance. Sarah's best friend Alex noticed her growing unease. They had been friends since college, and Alex was the person she trusted most. However, even with Alex, she felt an uneasy hesitation. Could her stalker be someone close, someone she knew? The thought gnawed at her, turning every interaction into a potential clue or a trap. One evening, as they sat in Sarah's apartment, Alex tried to comfort her, suggesting perhaps it was a prank or an admirer gone too far. Yet the gifts were too personal, too tailored. Sarah couldn't shake off the feeling that these weren't the actions of a well-meaning but misguided suitor. They were the calculated moves of someone who wanted her to know they were watching, always watching. The climax of this silent terror came during a routine evening when Sarah returned home to find a small velvet box on her doorstep. Her heart raced as she picked it up, fingers trembling. Inside was a delicate silver locket, but what made her blood run cold was not the jewelry itself, but what it contained. A lock of hair, her hair. The intimacy of the item was overwhelming, a clear violation of her personal space, her very identity. That night, sleep eluded Sarah. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the locket now locked away in her safe, yet its presence seemed to permeate the room. Each shadow cast by the moonlight through her blinds suggested the outline of someone lurking, watching. She started to see patterns in the shadows, figures in the darkness. Her fear was not just of being watched, but of what might happen if she ever caught the watcher's eye directly. In an attempt to regain some control, Sarah decided to leave work early one day, hoping to catch her observer off guard. She walked briskly through the city, her senses heightened, every passerby a potential suspect. The streets were her battleground, and she was determined to turn the tables. She chose a different route home, one less travelled, lined with tall old buildings that cast long shadows even in the daylight. Halfway down this street, she felt it again, the sensation of eyes upon her, but this time it was accompanied by the soft scuffing of footsteps behind her. Her heart pounded, but she didn't dare to turn around. Instead, she quickened her pace, her mind racing through self-defense classes she had taken years ago. The footsteps matched hers, neither gaining nor falling behind, as if the follower was content to keep pace, to maintain the chase without ever closing the distance. Sarah's resolve hardened. Reaching into her purse, she grasped her pepper spray, ready to confront whoever was behind her. But as she made it to the end of the alley, the footsteps stopped. She turned, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the alley was empty, save for the shadows and the distant sounds of the city. The watcher had vanished, leaving Sarah alone with her fear, her heart still racing from the adrenaline. Back in her apartment, she locked the door, her hands shaking as she secured every lock. The Watcher was out there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting. But for what? The question haunted her as she sat in the dim light of her living room. The city's night noises, a backdrop to her growing paranoia. The gifts had escalated from tokens of affection to threats of invasion. Sarah knew now she wasn't just being watched. She was being hunted. The realization settled over her like a heavy cloak, chilling and inescapable. The oppressive atmosphere that had enveloped Sarah's life didn't relent. Instead, it seemed to tighten its grip like a noose. The city of Crestwood, with its towering buildings and bustling streets, now felt like a labyrinth designed to confuse and conceal. Her days were a mix of professional commitments and a growing obsession with uncovering her unseen tormentor. One Saturday morning, the usual silence of the weekend was shattered by sirens. Sarah, already on edge, peered through her window to see an ambulance and police cars parked outside her building. Dread coiled in her stomach as she watched the emergency services rush into the building. Mrs. Thompson, the kind elderly woman who lived in the apartment next to Sarah, was found unresponsive in her home. The news spread through the building like wildfire, igniting whispers and worried glances. Sarah felt a surge of guilt. She had been so consumed by her own fears that she hadn't checked on Mrs. Thompson recently, who often looked out for her. The police were initially discreet, but the word around the building was that Mrs. Thompson's death was suspicious. Sarah's heart sank further when she discovered a note slipped under her door. It was handwritten, the same elegant script as the card that came with the lilies. The note was brief, chilling in its simplicity. Neighbors can be so close yet so far away. The implications were terrifying. Had her stalker moved from mere observation to something far more sinister? The thought that Mrs. Thompson's death might be connected to her watcher, made Sarah feel responsible and utterly vulnerable. Sarah decided to visit Mrs. Thompson's apartment under the pretense of paying her respects. The door was slightly ajar, a police officer inside collecting evidence. The officer, recognizing Sarah as a neighbor, allowed her a brief look inside. The scene was orderly, too orderly for someone who had lived alone for decades. There were no signs of struggle, but Sarah noticed something off. A picture frame on the mantel was turned around, something Mrs. Thompson would never have done. The frame contained an old photograph of Mrs. Thompson and her late husband at a younger age. Sarah remembered seeing it every time she visited the old woman. Now, on the back of the frame, someone had written a message with a pen, the ink fresh. Too close. The officer, seeing Sarah's reaction, asked if she was all right. She managed a nod, her mind racing. This was a message, not just to her, but to anyone close to her. Was this the work of her stalker, or was she spiraling into paranoia? Determined to find some semblance of control, Sarah began to document everything. She started a journal, logging every gift, every odd occurrence, every time she felt watched. Her entries became a catalogue of fear, each page a testament to her growing isolation. The day after the funeral, held quietly in the building's community room, Sarah received another package. This one was different. It was delivered by courier, not left anonymously. Inside was a small, ornate jewelry box. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, half expecting another lock of hair or a more sinister token. Instead, she found a ring. Gold with an intricate pattern, one that looked eerily like one Mrs. Thompson often wore. A wedding ring. A wave of nausea hit her. This wasn't just a message, it was a taunt, a display of power. The stalker was not only watching her, but was also toying with her life, her connections, her past. Sarah felt the room spin, the walls closing in. She needed answers, and she needed them fast. That night, Sarah didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, every light on, her laptop open as she researched obsessively. She looked into local crime patterns, unsolved cases, anything that might connect her stalker to Mrs. Thompson's death. The city's history of crime seemed to mock her from the screen. She also considered who in her life could have such intimate knowledge of her. Clients, colleagues, even friends. The thought that her stalker could be someone she knew, perhaps even trusted, was paralyzing. Her research led her to forums about stalking, where victims shared their stories. One post caught her eye. A user described receiving gifts that escalated in personal significance, much like Sarah's experience. The user had ended their post with a chilling warning: "It always ends with violence. Protect yourself." The sentiment echoed in Sarah's mind as she fortified her apartment. She installed additional locks, set up cameras, and even considered moving, though the thought of leaving felt like admitting defeat to her invisible adversary. As the night deepened, the silence in her apartment was broken only by the occasional car passing far below. Sarah sat with her back to the wall, her eyes scanning the room, her thoughts consumed by the presence of an unseen watcher. She was no longer just a target. She was now a participant in a deadly game where the stakes were life and death. The realization that Mrs. Thompson might have been the first victim in this twisted narrative made her resolve harden. She would not be next. In the days following Mrs. Thompson's funeral, Sarah's sense of isolation deepened. Each day felt like stepping deeper into a fog where every person was a potential shadow of her stalker. Her vigilance had turned into an exhaustive routine. She scrutinized every face at work, every neighbor in the lobby, and every passerby on the street for signs of undue interest in her life. Sarah's work began to suffer. Her focus was splintered, her once sharp legal mind now constantly analyzing the behavior of those around her. At the office, she found herself avoiding casual conversations, fearing that each interaction might reveal too much about her, might give her stalker more ammunition. The gifts continued now with a sinister twist. A small, fabric-bound book arrived, filled with blank pages, but the cover was inscribed with her name, Sarah Ellis, in that same, now familiar calligraphy. It felt like an invitation to write her own ending, a morbid gift from someone who seemed to believe they could dictate her fate. Her investigation into Mrs. Thompson's death led her to the archives of local news, combing through obituaries and police reports. She discovered that there had been similar unexplained deaths, not enough to form a clear pattern, but enough to raise suspicion. Each case involved an older, solitary individual, their deaths initially ruled as natural or accidental. Yet there was always something off, something that didn't sit right with the official narrative. One evening, as dusk began to paint the sky with streaks of orange and purple, Sarah decided to confront Alex with her fears. They met at a quiet cafe, a place away from prying eyes. Alex, sensing the change in Sarah, had grown concerned. Sarah observed Alex with a new, critical eye. Could it be him? His knowledge of her life was intimate. His behavior towards her had always been protective, almost possessive. She shared everything with him, the gifts, the feeling of being watched, the death of Mrs. Thompson, even the ring. Alex's reaction was one of shock and concern, his face paling. He insisted on helping her, suggesting they go to the police, but Sarah hesitated. She feared that without concrete evidence, her story would be dismissed as the ramblings of a paranoid woman. The conversation with Alex, while comforting in its own way, left Sarah more confused. He seemed genuinely worried, yet she couldn't shake the feeling that her stalker might be closer than she thought. She decided to start watching those around her, including Alex, more closely. That night, back at her apartment, Sarah set up a small hidden camera outside her door. If someone was coming and going without her knowledge, she needed proof. She also began to log her daily movements more meticulously, hoping to catch her stalker in the act, or at least understand his pattern. However, it was the next day's event that truly shook her. Walking to work, she noticed a figure. It was subtle, a man in nondescript clothing, but something in his posture, the way he paused when she looked his way, made her heart skip. He wasn't following her directly, but he was always there, in her periphery, blending into the crowd. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to confront him, but she knew better. Instead, she decided to test her theory. She altered her route, took a sudden turn into a less crowded street. To her dismay, the figure followed suit, keeping his distance but unmistakably tracking her. This was the break she needed. She didn't go to work that day. Instead, she spent hours in a public library researching security systems, legal protections for stalkers, and self-defense. Her mind was a whirlwind, but she was beginning to piece together a plan. Returning home, she found another package waiting for her. This time, it was her own photograph cropped to focus on her face with a red X drawn over her eyes. The message was clear. He was escalating, and she was the target. That night, Sarah reviewed the footage from her door camera. There, clear as day, was the figure from earlier. He stood outside her door for several minutes, looking around before leaving something and walking away. The timestamp was from the early hours of the morning. Her suspicions were now concrete fears. The stalker wasn't just watching, he was interacting with her life in the most intimate, terrifying ways. The realization that he had been right there, so close to her personal space, fueled a mix of fear and anger within her. Sarah knew she needed to act, but how? She considered the police again, but feared her lack of solid evidence would make her seem hysterical. She needed more, something undeniable. She decided to set a trap. She would leave clues, breadcrumbs that might draw out her stalker, give him a false sense of security, or perhaps even a chance to catch him in the act. Her life had become a chess game where every move was calculated, not just for her survival, but to end this nightmare. The watcher in the shadows was no longer an abstract fear. He was a real menacing presence, and Sarah was determined to confront him on her terms. Sarah's apartment had become a fortress, a place where every shadow was scrutinized, every sound analyzed. Her life was no longer about thriving, but surviving, and her mind was constantly at war with the fear that gripped her. However, amidst the chaos, a plan was beginning to take shape, one that would require her to become both bait and hunter. The next morning, she left for work as usual, but instead of heading to her office, she spent the day in a cafe, strategically placed halfway between her home and work. From there, she watched the flow of people, looking for the figure she had seen shadowing her the day before. Hours passed, and as dusk approached, there was no sign of him. Feeling a mix of relief and disappointment, Sarah decided to return home. As she walked, her senses were heightened, every passerby a potential suspect, but the walk back was uneventful, almost eerily so. Reaching her apartment, she found another envelope slipped under her door. Her heart raced as she opened it, expecting another chilling gift or threat. Inside was a single photograph, not of her this time, but of Alex. He was leaving his apartment, captured in a moment where he looked over his shoulder as if he sensed he was being watched. The message was clear. Her stalker knew Alex, knew his routines, and was warning her. The discovery was a double-edged sword. It validated her suspicions that this was more than just a personal vendetta. It was about control, about playing with her life like a puppet master. But it also meant that Alex, her closest ally, might now be in danger because of her. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. The city outside was a canvas of lights, but inside her mind, darkness reigned. She decided she needed to do more than observe. She needed to act. She would set a trap, and for that she required bait. The next day, she altered her routine drastically. Instead of going to work, she left early in the morning, dressed in her usual work attire, but instead of heading downtown, she went to the park. She chose a spot where she had often seen the figure lurking, and she sat, reading a book, making herself visible. Throughout the day she caught glimpses of him, the figure from the day before, always at a distance observing. Her plan was working. He was following her predictable change of routine. Now came the riskier part of her plan. She needed to make him believe she was vulnerable, alone. That evening she returned home, but not before leaving a note at the park, tucked under a stone near where she had sat. The note was simple, suggesting she'd be alone at her apartment the following night, a lie, but one she hoped would lure her stalker into a mistake. Back at her apartment, she prepared. She installed a second camera, this time inside, positioned to capture anyone entering her living room. She made her home appear less secure, leaving a window slightly open, a subtle invitation. She also informed the building security of her plan, explaining her situation under the guise of a prank, ensuring they would be alert without alarming them too much. The night she had set for her trap was tense. Every sound was magnified in her ears. She sat in her darkened living room, her back to the wall, a small lamp casting a dim light, enough to see, but not too much to show she was waiting. Time dragged on, the clock ticking loudly, a relentless reminder of her vulnerability. Then, just after midnight, a shadow moved outside her window. Her heart leaped into her throat. The figure was there. His silhouette against the city lights. He was cautious, checking around before attempting to climb through the window. Sarah's breath was shallow, her body tense. She watched as the shadow became a man, entering her home with a quiet, practiced ease. He moved towards her, or rather, where he thought she would be. But Sarah wasn't there. She was behind him, in the shadows she had learned to use as well. The moment he realized she wasn't where she should be, he turned, but it was too late. Sarah flipped on the light, blinding him momentarily. His face, when it came into view, was not what she expected. It wasn't Alex or any colleague she knew, but a face she thought she might have seen around her building or perhaps in the crowd at the park. The confrontation was silent, a stare-down filled with tension. But before anything could escalate, sirens wailed in the distance, the sound of security finally responding to her earlier alert. The man panicked, trying to flee, but Sarah, with surprising strength born of fear and resolve, managed to trip him, causing him to fall just as the security team burst through her door. The scene that followed was a blur of shouting, restraining, and the cold realization that this might not be the end. As the police arrived, cuffing the intruder, Sarah noticed something fall from his pocket. A small, old photograph. One she recognized. It was of Mrs. Thompson, in a frame identical to the one turned around in her apartment. The police questioned her, and the intruder, whose name was revealed to be Mark Bennett, remained silent, his eyes cold, devoid of fear or remorse. Among his possessions was a detailed journal chronicling his obsession with Sarah and, chillingly, mentions of others confirming her worst fears. As the police took him away, Sarah felt a mix of relief and lingering dread. Mark Bennett was caught, but the entries in his journal hinted at a network, or at least others like him. The revelation that Mrs. Thompson was not merely a victim of circumstance, but a deliberate target, meant there might be more to this than one man's obsession. The night ended with a new layer of fear for Sarah. The stalker was in custody, but the shadow of his actions, the possibility of others, loomed large. The game had changed, but the game was far from over. The days following Mark Bennett's arrest were a surreal blend of relief and heightened paranoia for Sarah. The police had confirmed that Bennett was indeed the perpetrator behind Mrs. Thompson's death, among others. His home was filled with evidence of his stalking habits, not just of Sarah, but of several other individuals, suggesting a pattern far more sinister than Sarah had initially imagined. Yet, the capture of one stalker did not dispel the shadows that had grown long around Sarah's life. Instead, her apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like the epicenter of her nightmares. Each corner seemed to echo with the memory of Bennett's intrusion, and every sound now carried with it the weight of suspicion. Sarah had taken leave from work, claiming personal reasons, but in truth, she was trying to piece her shattered sense of security back together. She spent hours reviewing the footage from her security cameras, looking for any sign that Bennett might not have been acting alone. Her sleep was fitful, plagued by dreams where the confines of her apartment morphed into a labyrinth with no escape. One evening, as the city's skyline began to light up with the hues of sunset, Sarah discovered something odd during her review of the footage. A few days before Bennett's arrest, there was movement outside her door that didn't quite fit. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a shadow passing, a person perhaps, not Bennett, but someone else. This revelation sent her spiraling. Had there been an accomplice? Was there another set of eyes watching her even now? The thought that Bennett might not have been the sole orchestrator of her torment drove her deeper into her self-imposed isolation. Her apartment, now equipped with even more security measures, felt like a cage. Every light was on, leaving no space for shadows to lurk, yet the darkness seemed to seep through the walls. Her obsession with her own safety turned inward, manifesting in strange, compulsive behaviors. She began rearranging furniture to block off windows, covering mirrors to avoid seeing reflections that might not be her own, and even stopped answering her phone, fearing it could be used to track her. Days turned into a blur, Sarah's once sharp mind, trained in the precision of legal arguments, now fixated on deciphering every sound, every anomaly in her environment. She started to see patterns in the mundane, believing that the positioning of objects in her apartment changed slightly when she wasn't looking, or that the temperature in certain rooms fluctuated without reason. Her descent was marked by an incident where she woke up in the middle of the night to find her apartment in disarray, furniture moved, and items misplaced. She couldn't remember doing it, yet no signs of forced entry were evident. Her first thought was that she'd been drugged or hypnotized, though she found no evidence of tampering with her food or drinks. Paranoia morphed into a companion as constant as the city's noise. She began to document everything in her journal, now filled with erratic notes, sketches of her apartment layout with arrows and circles indicating where she thought these intrusions might have occurred. Sarah's isolation was broken one late afternoon by the sound of her doorbell. Her heart raced, but through the peephole she saw Alex. His presence was both comforting and terrifying. She let him in, her hands trembling as she unlatched the multiple locks she had installed. Alex's concern was palpable. He had been calling, texting, but Sarah had been unreachable. He noticed the changes in her apartment, the new security measures, the disarray. His eyes scanned the journal on the table, filled with her obsessive notes. Sarah tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a jumbled mess of fear and conspiracy. Alex attempted to calm her, to bring her back from the edge of her paranoia. He suggested therapy, a change of environment, but Sarah was resistant, convinced that her vigilance was all that stood between her and another potential attack. She believed that anyone, even Alex, could be part of this larger, unseen threat. As he left, promising to check in on her soon, Sarah felt the isolation close in again. The thought that even Alex might not be who he seemed gnawed at her. She started to set traps around her apartment, simple things like hair across doorways to detect if they opened, or placing small objects in positions they wouldn't naturally return to after being moved. Her life had become a puzzle where every piece was suspect. The outside world, once her battlefield, now felt like an extension of her home's labyrinthine paranoia. One night, while reviewing her security footage again, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. The shadow she had seen before was back, clearer this time. It wasn't just outside her door, it was inside her apartment, moving through her living room when she was supposedly alone. The realization that she might not be alone even in her fortress shattered the last vestiges of her sanity. She couldn't trust her senses, her memories, or her safety protocols. The Watcher in the shadows had evolved from a physical threat into a psychological terror, one that lived within the walls of her own mind, perhaps even within the very fabric of her reality. The night deepened, and with it Sarah's descent into madness. Every creak of the building, every whisper of the wind outside became the footsteps of an unseen observer. She was no longer just watched. She was haunted by the possibility that the Watcher was not just one, but many, or perhaps not even real at all. Sarah's apartment had transformed into a fortress of paranoia, every inch scrutinized for signs of intrusion, every sound analyzed for threats. Yet, the more she fortified her space, the more it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on her. The shadow in her footage haunted her thoughts, a spectre of doubt that made her question her reality. In her obsession, Sarah devised a plan not just to catch any potential intruder, but to reclaim her life from the shadows that seemed to control it. She would set a trap, one that required her to become vulnerable, to draw her tormentor out of hiding if indeed there was one. The plan was simple in concept, but required precision in execution. She would leave her apartment unguarded one night, making it appear as though she had let down her guard. She would use every tool at her disposal to monitor this setup, ensuring she could catch anyone who dared to enter her domain. The chosen night was storm-ridden. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled like a chorus of lost souls. Sarah prepared meticulously. She placed her phone in the bedroom, charging, with a message app open to give the illusion she was using it. The lights were left on in various rooms, but not all, to mimic her usual pattern. The main camera was visible, but she had installed two hidden ones, one in the living room and another in the hallway. Her actual position was in the maintenance closet, a cramped space where she could watch the live feed from her phone. She had cleared out enough room to sit, her heart pounding in her chest, adrenaline coursing through her veins. The door was ajar just enough to let her slip out if needed, but from the outside, it looked closed. Hours passed with only the sound of the storm for company. Sarah's senses were on high alert, every raindrop a potential intruder, every gust of wind a possible whisper of someone moving outside her door. Then, just as doubt began to creep into her mind about the efficacy of her plan, something changed. The light in the hallway flickered, a subtle sign, but to Sarah, it was as loud as a siren. Her eyes glued to the screen. She watched as the figure appeared on the monitor. It was not Mark Bennett. This was someone else, someone she hadn't seen before. The figure was careful, checking for her presence, moving silently through her living room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't the shadow from her paranoia. This was real, an actual intruder. The sight of him, his methodical movements as he inspected her home, confirmed her worst fears. She was not alone in her ordeal. The man began to tamper with her visible security camera, unaware of the others. He moved towards her bedroom, likely to check on her. This was the moment Sarah had been waiting for. She slipped out of the closet, her steps silent over the sounds of the storm. Her hand gripped a canister of pepper spray, the only weapon she felt comfortable using in such close quarters. She positioned herself by the bedroom door, heart racing, her plan now a gamble between her safety and catching her stalker. As the intruder turned to leave the bedroom, satisfied with his check, or perhaps expecting to find her asleep, Sarah was there, a shadow in the darkness. The confrontation was swift. Sarah sprayed the pepper spray, aiming for his eyes. The man recoiled, coughing, his hands flying to his face. She didn't hesitate. She charged at him, pushing him back into the bedroom, using her body weight to keep him down. He was disoriented, but his size gave him an advantage even as he struggled to see. The struggle was brief but intense. Sarah knew she had to keep him incapacitated long enough to call for help. She managed to pin one of his arms under her knee, her other hand fumbling for her phone to dial emergency services. As the call connected, the man beneath her began to recover from the spray's effects, his free hand reaching out. Panic surged through Sarah, but then suddenly the door to her apartment burst open. It wasn't the police, not yet, but Alex, whose face was a mask of concern and determination. Alex had been worried about Sarah's refusal to leave her apartment, his own fears for her safety pushing him to check on her despite her isolation. His arrival was fortuitous. He quickly assessed the situation and helped subdue the intruder until the police arrived, sirens wailing through the storm. The police took the man into custody, his identity unknown to Sarah, but the look in his eyes as they cuffed him was not of a random criminal, but of someone with purpose, with a connection to her life she couldn't yet fathom. In the aftermath, as officers questioned her, Sarah felt the weight of her paranoia lift slightly. She had proof, physical evidence that her fears weren't entirely in her head. Yet, the shadow on the footage, the manipulations of her space, the psychological torment she had endured suggested there might still be more to uncover. Alex stayed with her, his presence a comfort she hadn't realized she needed. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the turmoil within. Sarah knew this was a victory, but not the end. The trap had worked, but it had also opened up more questions. Who was this man? Was he acting alone, or was there a network of watchers? And most chillingly, was this the last of her stalkers, or merely another piece in a larger, more terrifying puzzle? The morning after the storm was as if the city itself needed to breathe, exhaling a sigh of relief in the form of clear skies and crisp air. For Sarah, however, the clarity outside did not penetrate the fog of fear and suspicion that still clouded her mind. The police had taken the intruder away, but his identity and motives remained a mystery wrapped in the enigma of her ongoing nightmare. Alex had agreed to stay with her, his presence a stabilizing force in her otherwise chaotic existence. They spent the morning in relative silence, Sarah replaying the events of the previous night in her head, each scenario ending with more questions than answers. The police were processing the intruder, but they had mentioned another name that sent chills down Sarah's spine: Daniel Warren, her ex-boyfriend from years ago, thought to have moved across the country. The idea that Daniel could be behind this was both plausible and terrifying. Their relationship had ended badly, with Daniel expressing a possessiveness that bordered on obsession. But to go to such lengths, to orchestrate this level of terror, seemed beyond even his worst behaviors. Yet, the name had been mentioned in connection with the intruder. Sarah's mind was a battlefield of denial and suspicion. She needed to know for certain. With Alex by her side for support, she decided to confront the possibility head-on. They made their way to the police station, where the intruder was being held. The station was a stark contrast to her apartment's disarray. Here, everything was structured, controlled. The officer in charge, Detective Lowe, greeted them with a professional demeanor. He allowed Sarah to view through a one-way mirror where the intruder sat, handcuffed and sullen, in an interrogation room. The man, whose name was given as Luke Harris, had no direct criminal history, but was known to the police through connections with others involved in stalking cases. His expression was one of resignation rather than defiance, which puzzled Sarah. If he was just a hired hand, where was the mastermind? Detective Lowe explained that they were still piecing together Luke's involvement, but a search of his possessions had uncovered a list of names, including Sarah's, alongside dates and notes that suggested he was part of a larger operation. One name on that list, underlined several times, was Daniel Warren. Sarah's heart sank. The revelation felt like confirmation of her darkest fears. Daniel, with whom she had once shared moments of love, now potentially harbored such hatred or obsession that he would invade her life in the most sinister way possible. The detective arranged for Daniel to be brought in for questioning, but until then, Sarah needed to face Luke. She stepped into the interrogation room, Alex and Detective Lowe watching from behind the mirror. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with tension as she sat across from Luke. Luke's eyes met hers, and in them she saw not just the face of her stalker, but the face of someone manipulated, perhaps even victimized in his own way. His voice was low as he explained his involvement, revealing that he had been coerced into these acts by someone who promised to protect his sister from their shared, dark past. It was through this conversation that Sarah learned about the Watchers, a small clandestine group of individuals who fed off the control and terrorizing of others. They operated under the guise of anonymity, using personal information and psychological manipulation to ensure compliance from members like Luke. The group's leader, according to Luke, was indeed Daniel Warren, who had turned his obsession with Sarah into a twisted game of power and revenge. The revelation was a gut punch. Sarah had to step outside, the room's walls feeling like they were closing in. Alex joined her, his presence grounding her as she processed the betrayal. The police, with this new information, now had a broader investigation on their hands, one that could potentially unravel an entire network. Back at home, the atmosphere was different. The fear of the unknown stalker had morphed into the concrete terror of someone she knew, someone she had once trusted. Sarah felt violated in a way she hadn't before. The personal nature of this betrayal made her feel as though her past was attacking her present. That night, unable to sleep and driven by a need for closure, Sarah and Alex set up a different kind of trap. She knew Daniel well enough to predict some of his patterns. his weaknesses. They staged her apartment to look unoccupied again, but this time they were ready with more than just surveillance. The police agreed to an undercover operation with officers positioned discreetly nearby. Sarah and Alex hid in a position where they could see without being seen. Their plan not just to catch Daniel in the act, but to end this nightmare on her terms. As the night deepened, the wait was excruciating. Then, just before dawn, the silence was broken by the sound of someone attempting to enter through the window, the same method used by the previous intruder. The figure was cautious but confident, a silhouette against the dim light. It was Daniel, his movements betraying his familiarity with the place. As he stepped inside, Sarah felt a surge of anger, betrayal, and a desperate need for this to end. The trap was sprung. Sarah emerged from her hiding spot, confronting Daniel directly, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. The police moved in, but in that moment of confrontation, it was Sarah's resolve against Daniel's obsession that defined the battle. The look on Daniel's face was one of shock, then anger, followed by a chilling smile that suggested he believed he still had control. But this time, it was Sarah who held the upper hand, her courage and the law standing with her. The confrontation in Sarah's apartment was charged with an intensity that seemed to bend time itself. Daniel Warren, caught in the act of intrusion, faced Sarah with an expression that oscillated between disbelief and rage. The presence of the police emerging from their hidden positions added weight to the scene, turning it from a private vendetta into a public reckoning. Daniel's initial shock gave way to defiance. He tried to assert control over the situation, his eyes searching for an escape or perhaps an ally among the shadows of the room, but there was nowhere to run. Sarah stood firm, her resolve like a shield against the storm of his obsession. The officers moved in, their professionalism contrasting sharply with Daniel's increasing agitation. They secured him with handcuffs, but not before he made a last, desperate attempt to reach Sarah, perhaps with words, perhaps with violence. But it was futile. The physical distance between them was now enforced by law, a boundary he could no longer cross. As Daniel was led away, Sarah felt a mix of relief and sorrow. This man, once part of her life, had become her worst nightmare. The police began to process the scene, gathering evidence while Detective Lowe approached Sarah with a mixture of respect and concern. He explained that they would need her for further questioning, to piece together the full extent of Daniel's involvement and the network he might have led. In the hours that followed, Sarah gave her statement, recounting every detail of her ordeal. The police were particularly interested in any information that could lead to other members of the Watchers. Luke Harris's confession had opened a Pandora's box, revealing a group that thrived on the manipulation and control of others, often through blackmail or coercion. During this time, Alex stayed close, his presence a reminder of the normalcy she had almost forgotten. His silent support helped Sarah navigate through the emotional wreckage left in the wake of betrayal. The investigation expanded rapidly. Daniel's apartment was searched, revealing a trove of surveillance equipment, notes detailing Sarah's daily life, and most disturbingly, personal items from other victims. The evidence painted a picture of a man whose obsession had consumed him, leading him to orchestrate a network of watchers, each feeding off the other's darkness. One chilling discovery was a journal, much like Sarah's, but filled with entries that detailed his descent into madness. It spoke of his initial love turning into a need to possess, to control. The names of others appeared, suggesting that Sarah was not his only target, but she was the one who had unwittingly become his obsession's focal point. With Daniel in custody, the immediate threat to Sarah lessened, but the psychological scars remained. The police continued their investigation, aiming to dismantle the Watchers, but for Sarah the focus was now on healing and reclaiming her life. The next day, Sarah, with Alex by her side, met with a therapist recommended by the police for victims of stalking. The session was a tentative step towards recovery, acknowledging the trauma she had endured, not just physically but mentally. The therapist emphasized that it would be a long journey, one where Sarah needed to rebuild her sense of security, trust, and self. In the following weeks, Sarah took proactive steps to reclaim her life. She moved to a new apartment, one with state-of-the-art security, but more importantly, one where she could start anew. She slowly returned to work, finding solace in the routine, though she was forever changed by her experiences. Her interactions with others were cautious at first, but gradually she began to trust again, to engage with the world without the constant fear of being watched. Alex remained a constant in her life, their friendship deepening, providing her with a sense of normalcy and support. One evening, as Sarah sat in her new home looking out at the city skyline, she reflected on her ordeal. She realized that while she had been a victim, she had also emerged as a survivor. The confrontation with Daniel had not just been about ending his reign of terror, but about affirming her own strength and resilience. The police kept her updated on the progress of their case. They had arrested several more members of the Watchers, each arrest providing more information, more victims coming forward. The network was being dismantled piece by piece, the darkness of their actions brought into the light. Sarah knew that the shadow of what happened would always linger, but she also understood that she could live with it, not as a victim, but as someone who had faced her fears and prevailed. The final act of this terrifying chapter of her life was about closure, about understanding that while one can't control the actions of others, they can control their response, their recovery, and ultimately, their narrative. As she closed her journal, now filled with her own story of survival, she felt a semblance of peace. The Watcher in the shadows was no longer an unseen threat, but a memory, one she was learning to live with, not as a reminder of fear, but as a testament to her strength. Months had passed since the night Sarah confronted Daniel, and her life had undergone a profound transformation. The city of Crestwood, once a labyrinth of fear, now felt like a place of rebirth. The legal proceedings against Daniel Warren and his network of the Watchers were ongoing, each court session peeling back layers of a psychological horror that had ensnared not just Sarah, but others whose stories were now coming to light. Sarah had returned to her work with a renewed focus, her experiences shaping her into an advocate for victims of stalking and harassment. Her legal prowess was now fueled by personal resolve, her cases echoing her own journey from victimhood to empowerment. Alex had become more than a friend. He was a co-conspirator in her new life, someone who had seen her at her lowest and now witnessed her rise. Their relationship had deepened, rooted in an understanding that only those who have faced such darkness together could share. One crisp autumn day, Sarah received a call from Detective Lowe. The case against Daniel was nearing its conclusion. The evidence was overwhelming, corroborated by other victims and the digital trail of the Watchers' activities. Lowe invited Sarah to attend the final hearing, offering her a chance to face her past in a legal setting, to see justice served. The courthouse was a temple of justice, its halls echoing with the solemn footsteps of those seeking closure or retribution. Sarah entered with Alex by her side, her heart beating with a mix of dread and anticipation. She had prepared for this moment, mentally rehearsing her impact statement, yet nothing could fully brace her for the reality of seeing Daniel again. The courtroom was filled with a quiet tension, the air thick with the weight of many stories, many victims. Daniel sat, his demeanor subdued, the flamboyance of his earlier confidence replaced by the stark reality of his situation. The trial proceeded with meticulous detail, each piece of evidence a testament to the network's operations. Witnesses, including former members of the Watchers coerced into their roles, provided chilling insights into how easily one's life could be turned into a performance for others' twisted entertainment. When Sarah's turn came to speak, she stood, her voice steady, her gaze fixed not on Daniel, but on the judge, the jury, the embodiment of justice. She recounted her ordeal, not with anger, but with a poignant clarity that captured the room's attention. Her words were not just for Daniel, they were for all those who had suffered in silence, for those who might still be watched in the shadows. Her statement highlighted not just the crimes committed against her, but the broader implications of such surveillance and control. She spoke of the psychological toll, the constant fear, the erosion of self, and finally the reclaiming of her identity through resilience and the support of those around her. As she finished, the courtroom was silent, the weight of her words lingering like a solemn vow to prevent future victims. The judge, visibly moved, thanked Sarah for her courage. The jury, after a brief deliberation, returned with a guilty verdict on multiple counts including stalking, conspiracy, and murder in relation to Mrs. Thompson and others linked to the Watchers. The sentencing was swift. Daniel was given life imprisonment with no possibility of parole, his network dismantled, his influence extinguished. As he was led away, his eyes met Sarah's for the last time, and in that gaze she found not the terror she once felt, but a profound sense of closure. After the trial, Sarah and Alex left the courthouse together, stepping into a world that felt different, lighter. They walked through the city, the streets busy with life, each person a story, each step a move towards recovery. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her advocacy work, speaking at conferences, helping to draft legislation aimed at protecting individuals from similar fates. She also made sure to keep in touch with the other victims, forming a support network that turned shared trauma into collective strength. One evening, as the city's lights began to twinkle against the encroaching night, Sarah stood on her balcony. Her new apartment, a symbol of her new life, was secure, but not a fortress. It was a home. She looked out at the horizon, where the city met the sky, and felt an overwhelming sense of peace. Her journey had been one of terror, but it had also been one of transformation. The Watcher in the shadows had been exposed, not just to the light of justice, but to the light of her own resilience. Sarah had learned that while one cannot control the darkness others might bring into their life, one can control how they respond, how they heal, and how they move forward. As she turned back inside, she noticed a small, unassuming gift on her coffee table. It was from Alex, a simple, elegant photo frame, empty, symbolizing the future moments they would fill together. Sarah smiled, placing it in a spot where the light would catch it, a daily reminder of her journey from darkness into light.